Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue. Welcome to our midweek Torah study. This is brought to you from our home, and we like to bring these to you to just encourage you and bless you. We are open to feedback, enjoy the discussions and conversations that we get into. Please respond in the comments if you're interested. Likewise, want to encourage you to subscribe, because if you subscribe, then you are notified when these teachings are published, and so on, so you can stay up with us. Another thing I want to make note of is some of you have chosen to support our ministry. We're very grateful for this. Your support allows us to continue, but we would ask that you consider your support in light of giving to the kingdom of God as a whole, because this ministry is definitely about the work of the kingdom of God. If you would like to join us and partner with us in this work, then please scroll down in the comments or the description below, and you'll find instructions of how to give. There'll be a link there that you can give online. So let's begin. This week we are in Parshat 7. This is Vayetze. He went out from Bereshit, Genesis chapter 28 through chapter 32. Incidentally, this is recorded a little bit late because of the Thanksgiving holiday, which we ran into last week. So some of you may not be getting this until the week following. This is the 7th Parsha this year. Vayetze, meaning he went out, opens with Jacob leaving his father and mother and his brother, of course. And I will quote a Parshat summary from a group called Or Sameach International. They provide Torah tools and teachings and resources and aids. Pretty good group of folks there that can provide you a lot of insight into the Torah. Fleeing from Esau, Jacob leaves Beersheba and sets out towards Haran, the home of his mother's family, and comes to Mount Moriah, the place where his father Isaac was to be sacrificed when Abraham took him up on the mountain, the place that Adonai showed Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So he comes to this same site. Incidentally, this is also the future site of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. He lays down to sleep, that is, Jacob lays down to sleep, and he has this profound dream. He has this prophetic dream of angels ascending and descending through the sky on a ladder between heaven and earth. Adonai promises him the land of Israel, that he will be the father of a great nation, and that he will be guarded by Adonai everywhere. And it says this in the text: I will guard you wherever you go, says Adonai. I will bring you back into this land, and I will leave you until I have done what I promised you. Jacob awakes and vows to build an altar there and to tithe all that he will receive. When he travels to Haran after this event, he travels to Haran, and meets his cousin Rachel at the well. He arranges with her father, Laban, if some of you have heard it pronounced that way, to work 7 years for her hand in marriage. But Laban deceives Jacob and substitutes Leah on the wedding night. And then Jacob has to commit himself to another 7 years in order to finally marry Rachel. And now he has 2 wives, and he sets out to work another so many years, I think 20 years additional to this. First Leah bears him 4 sons, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, or Reuben, Simon, and Levi, and Judah. These are the first of the tribes of Israel. Rachel is jealous that she cannot have a child, and so she gives her handmaiden Bilhah to Jacob, and Bilhah bears both Dan and Naphtali by Jacob. Leah also gives Jacob her handmaiden Zilpah, and Zilpah bears Gad and Asher to Jacob. Leah now gives birth to Yissachar, Zebulun, and a daughter Dinah. And Adonai finally blesses Rachel with a son, Yosef. Jacob decides to leave Laban, but Laban is aware of how much wealth Jacob has acquired for him and is reluctant to let him go. And he concludes a contract of employment with him. Again, Lavan tries to swindle Jacob, but is unsuccessful, and Jacob becomes extremely wealthy. 20 years later, Jacob, aware that Lavan has become resentful of his wealth, and the sons as well, takes advantage of his father-in-law's temporary absence and flees with his family. Lavan pursues them, but is warned by Adonai not to harm them. A covenant is agreed upon by Jacob and Lavan. Lavan returns home. Jacob, Yaakov, continues on his way to face his brother Esau. Okay, so that's a summary of the Parsha, which I thought was nice, and that comes to us via the website Or Sameach International. All right, so what are we going to look at? The first thing that I want to talk to you about today is context. Sometimes context means looking at the immediate surroundings of a passage. So you would look at the immediate surroundings of the narrative, the setting, the teaching, the listeners, the audience, the speakers, the purpose, and so forth and so on. And sometimes context also means looking at the previous history or the setting that led up to the subject, event, or passage, because that allows you to see it in light of its historical precedents, the things that came before. Other times, context is macro, and this is the danger that we fall into. Sometimes we think context is limited to immediate, and yet context can also be a macro view, a wide-angle lens. And sometimes we want to look at the event or the scriptural passage in light of the entire time span of human history. So, like we see the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we see the tree, or we see the tree of life in the Gan Eden with Garden of Eden. And we may say, okay, let's look at the context. Well, that context might be the immediate surroundings of the passage, speaking to that. Or you could connect the tree of life in the garden to the tree of life in the Revelation, and find yourself with a macro context, a context that literally spans human history. So let's look at the blessing of Abraham in that sort of quote-unquote context. What does the blessing of Abraham mean when you look at the entirety of human history? Now, when we speak of the blessing of Abraham, we're speaking of these two pillars of the blessing of Abraham. That is the land and the descendants of Abraham. And so what we have is we have the ancient history, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then we have the sojourning, the 12 tribes down in Egypt, and they come to become a huge nation in 210 years. And then they come out of Egypt along with other people in their tow, other Gentiles, and they begin to make their way towards Canaan. It takes about 40 years of wandering in the desert because of their stubbornness, but eventually they get there, and they're on the edge of conquering the land. And then we have the two books back to back, the book of Joshua and the book of Judges in the Bible, and this is the narrative of what happens. And the end of the books of Joshua and Judges, and then subsequently Kings and Chronicles, and Samuel as well, the entirety of this sort of near ancient history and middle ancient history, if you will, of Israel is quite discouraging because they end up in exile. Israel was conquered and occupied by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians, and then by the Persians. Assyria was conquered by the Medes and the Chaldeans, which were known as the Babylonians. And then Babylonia was then conquered by Cyrus the Great, the Persians. And Persia was then, afterwards, conquered by Alexander the Great, the Macedon, who united the Greeks. But prior to that, in Persia, the people of Israel were allowed to, by the ruling of the king, allowed to return and first of all rebuild the altar, rebuild the temple, and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But of course, the Persians were conquered by, and this was accomplished and it's detailed in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. This was accomplished, but the Persians were later conquered by Alexander the Great. And after his death, the Seleucids ruled over the land of Israel. The Seleucids introduced Hellenism, which affected the entire known world of the Near East and the Middle East. Hellenism was the practice of Greek culture, Greek art, politics, architecture, rural education, money, finance, economics. Basically, it was the infiltration of Hellenism was throughout all the cultures of that known world at that time. It did become successful by introducing many civilized dignities into the world. They were eventually diminished by the rise of Parthia and by the Romans. But during the time of the Greeks, Hellenism brought much advancement to the ancient world and much civilization to the ancient world. They were gradually eclipsed by the Romans and the Parthians, and Rome became the dominant power. During this time, when Rome had its ascendancy, the Hasmonean dynasty was ruling Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And during that time, the Maccabees had gained their freedom from the Seleucids and lived semi-autonomously throughout the decline of the Seleucids. Remember, the Seleucids were the leftovers from the Greeks. Rome first acknowledged or recognized the independent state of Israel in about 139 BCE, before Common Era. But later in 63 BCE, invaded Eretz Israel and set up a Roman government over Israel. For a brief period of time, around 44 BCE, the Hasmoneans were able to gain Israel independence from Rome to some degree, but the Romans returned with great force and destruction and completely conquered under Mark Antony and Octavian, and a Herodian dynasty was installed to rule Judah in 37 BCE, I believe. Hopefully my dates are correct on some of this. This Herodian rulership was in effect right up into the time of Yeshua. Because of lingering animosity from the brutal conquest at the hands of Mark Antony and Octavian, because of the general harshness and brutality of Roman rule, and because of the betrayal of the Herodian dynasty, the Judeans were always trying to regain their independence. They would use guerrilla tactics, they would use rebellions, they would use revolutionary tactics to try to organize a resistance. And we see this come to full force in 66 AD, or 66 CE, depending on your counting. The resistance became more organized during that time. Excuse me. Emperor Nero had died in Rome, I believe, at his own hand. He may have committed suicide. Vespasian was declared the emperor, and so he had to return to Rome, and he left Titus in charge of the response to a rebellion that began in 66 CE. In 70 CE, Titus began to go through Judea and Samaria and basically sack everything, and his response was very brutal. In about 70 CE, the siege of Jerusalem began, and the sacking of Jerusalem was a total annihilation and exile into slavery of nearly every single person in Jerusalem. They stacked bodies as high as buildings, it was written. The temple was destroyed and burned, even though Vespasian had left instructions that the temple be preserved. But the crowds, the Romans, were so bloodthirsty that they were just out for destruction. And at the same time, it was reported that there was great treasure and wealth in the temple. Of course, that had long since been removed. And so the Roman soldiers could not be restrained by their commander, and at least, or so the story goes. And they basically destroyed the temple, burned it to the ground. Um, there were other outposts of this rebellion that were eventually wiped out over the course of the next few years. By 73 CE, various other outposts were wiped out, including Masada. This is, of course, referenced in Josephus and also referenced in the History of Rome, published in 1883. I think it's Drury et al., Drury and others. So that's where we end up. We end up the story at 73 CE, and this is post-Yeshua, after Yeshua had come and resurrected. And this is after the way, the people of the way, the Messianic believers in Judea had grown in great prominence by this time, and had become quite obvious and aware, and people were aware of them. Incredible growth. And yet this destruction of Jerusalem under Titus was effective at sending pretty much all of Israel into the diaspora. From that point forward, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, the land defined by Adonai, the land was the subject of various Gentile nations and peoples under control up until 1948. So we're looking at nearly 1900 years of domination over Eretz Israel by foreign and secular powers. When Israel gained independence in 1948, this is what turned the tide on this. Most would say that the ensuing 2,000 years or so, from the fall of Jerusalem, the establishment of rabbinic Judaism and synagogue centrality to worship in the people of Israel, the people of Jacob, the Jews, with the corresponding rise of Gentile exclusivity, as some people would say, these things were part of the plan of Adonai, that the kingdom of Adonai, the kingdom, would rise and gain the prominence over, first of all, Eretz Israel, the land, and secondly, Judaism as an expression of the people of the land. I think this is a flawed presumption, and this is kind of goes to the heart of where we're at in the world today. We have centuries of Gentile prominence, and I don't object to Gentile prominence per se, for the sheer fact that the Jews are low in numbers. Just the demographic of the Jews versus the Gentiles is kind of incredible, and yet we would be wrong to suggest that or to not understand or realize that the Gentile believers in Adonai are going to far outnumber the Jews. That's just the nature of the demographic. But this idea that therein, because of the demographic, because of the statistic, that somehow we have proven the point that Adonai's plan was that the Gentiles rise in prominence over either the land, Eretz Israel, or the people of the land, the Jews. There are three ways of thinking about this, of thinking about Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and the Jews. It was to be a forerunner of the kingdom. The first kind of paradigm, or the first way of thinking about this, is that Eretz Israel and the Jews, the people of Israel, they were both to be a forerunner of the kingdom of Adonai. And what some people believe, and I'm just reciting what people believe. What some people believe is that Eretz Israel and the Jews were actually a forerunner of the kingdom of Adonai and of the Christians. So it is that the kingdom of Adonai has replaced Eretz Israel, and that Christianity has replaced Judaism. And then the Gentile Christians have replaced the Jews. And this is described and practiced among much of Gentile Christianity. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it. Second way of thinking about it, Eretz Israel was to continue as an independent entity in the world, parallel to and alongside of the Gentile kingdom, And likewise, the kingdom of Adonai was to have existed within the culture and the nation state of the Gentile nations, parallel and alongside of Judaism, the way that Judaism has existed. The third option, that's the second sort of paradigm. The third paradigm is that the kingdom of Adonai was to have existed within the culture and within the nation state of Israel. In other words, the kingdom of Adonai, which consists of Gentiles, believers, and the believers, how they interact and communicate with each other. It is a functional kingdom. It is not a kingdom of land. It is not a kingdom of geography. It is a kingdom of love among those who love each other, who have accepted Yeshua. All right. So the kingdom of Israel was this third paradigm, that the kingdom of Israel is to have existed within the culture and within the nation state of Israel. That is what we see in Israel today, which is Gentile believers in Israel believing in Yeshua and Jewish believers in Israel believing in Yeshua. And therein is an example of the kingdom, Gentile and Jew together, one in Messiah, in the kingdom within the land of Israel, functionally tied to the land and the people. All right. So those are kind of the three paradigms that you can get into when we're talking about, again, this is all discussion within the macro perspective of the context. And what is it we're talking about here? It's the context for this promise, which Adonai made to Jacob. It is the blessing of Abraham. All right. What I want to do is I want to analyze the story of Jacob with this macro understanding in mind, that the only legitimate way to view the macro span of human history, the story of mankind, the story of humanity, is to put Israel, the Eretz Israel, the original land and the original peoples, Eretz Israel, the land, and the people, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, that these are both the original land and the original covenanted peoples, and to allow them to have a place of significance and prominence as one of the building stones for understanding the time span, the frame of human history. One of the comparisons that I like to make is this comparison of Eretz Israel with the kingdom of Adonai. The history of Israel with the land can be compared to the history of the kingdom of Adonai post destruction of the temple. What many of you probably, well, I should say it this way: what some of you, the paradigm that some of you have, is that that Christianity has had a largely linear and non-dramatic timeline, and I think an honest evaluation of history would bring some criticism to that viewpoint, such that if we analyze the kingdom of Adonai post-destruction of the temple, then we start to see some parallels and similarities to the narrative of Am Israel, the people of Israel. Okay. The people of Adonai, the people of the law of Adonai, who were exiled to Babylon and then to Persia, who went into exile in Egypt, who went into the diaspora during Hellenism, who went into the diaspora after the destruction of the temple, after the fall of Jerusalem, how did their worship and observance of the Torah function in light of these compromises in foreign lands? So here's an example. In the Torah, we're commanded to make 3 pilgrimage festivals every year. If you're somebody poor living in Rome, if you're Jewish and you live in Babylon or Persia, you can't make the journey. You're not going to make the trip. Or you may be a slave and you can't make the journey. Or you may be tied to the land. You may be in Mitzrayim, Egypt, and cannot make the land. You can't make the journey. Likewise, you may have been oppressed, or you may have been persecuted and cannot function, cannot worship in the fullness of the Torah instructions. You don't have a temple anymore. How do you worship without the temple? So on and so forth. So we could discuss these sort of practical compromises to the Jewish tradition post-destruction of the temple and post-exile and post-diaspora. But I think what we have is we have a direct comparison through the history of evangelical Christianity. Let me explain. The Orthodox Christian and the Catholic, and then later the Church of England, other overarching religious powers and control structures, they all enforced compromises to the true worship of Adonai. In fact, prior to the Reformation, there was so much corruption in the Gentile people of the church. There was so much corruption that it wasn't identifiable as the gospel of Yeshua. It was a distortion of the gospel of Yeshua. We make much of the Samaritans who distorted the Torah, and yet what do we see in the latter part of the medieval ages? We see the same corruption and distortion in the kingdom of Adonai in the church world. But, like, for example, prior to the Reformation and prior to other gains and improvements, Christians, Gentile Christians, were not allowed to assemble for a Bible study or for worship. They were not allowed to read freely and study freely and discuss freely. Even after the Reformation, for a time, there were many sects of authentic worshipers, people who were trying to follow Adonai, who were persecuted, like the Anabaptists and others. Here's my point. True worshipers of Adonai, those who worship in spirit and in truth, unlike the Samaritans who say this is how you should worship, right? Because that's what the Samaritans were saying. They were saying on this mountain is how you worship. Worship on Gerizim. Remember the woman at the well was discussing this with Yeshua. The Samaritans say this is how you should worship. The true worshipers are endeavoring and trying to worship Adonai in spite of the compromise, in spite of the threats, in spite of the difficulties that were handed down through the institutions of Christianity through the centuries. Likewise, Judaism, the authentic worship of Adonai, has been compromised by governments and by religious authorities. The true worship of Adonai in the Jewish Israel historical and biblically authentic worship has always been practiced by a remnant. Of this we are promised and assured. But we have to acknowledge the overarching experience, which was that there was much distortion and much compromise. And I submit to you that there was distortion and compromise on both sides. If nothing else, the distortion of substituting the synagogue life for Yeshua, or excluding Yeshua from the synagogue life, when the rabbis had to reinvent Judaism after the fall of the temple. Let's return to our parsha. Jacob is returning to the land of his fathers, to Haran. In the previous parsha, Isaac said to Jacob, "May he, El Shaddai, give you the blessing of Abraham." What was the blessing of Abraham? The blessing of Abraham is land and descendants, that you may take possession of the land, which Adonai gave to Abraham. This was the blessing Jacob received from Isaac. Immediately after setting out, we have this. Jacob has a dream. It is the ladder or stairway going up. You can't help but see the temple and the stairway as similarities of types of each other. The function of prayers going up and down. This is what worship and sacrifice was at the temple, a place of prayer. My house shall be called a house of prayer. Our prayers are like messages that are taken up and taken down. Every message needs a messenger. Who is it that carries our prayers into heaven? The messengers. When you make Aliyah, you always go up. When you go to Israel, you always go up. Adonai is at the top, going up to Israel, at the top of the stairway, going up the stairway to Adonai. And then elsewhere, we've got the train of his robe filling the temple. Isaiah chapter 6. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw Adonai sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. What is it we're describing there? Well, we don't know if it's an exact representation of this, but it certainly brings to mind this vision, this dream that it was down here. It said, a female standing above me had 6 wings. 2 he covered his face, 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. One called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is Adonai's oath, the whole earth is full of his glory. Then the posts of the door trembled at the voice of those who called. Verse 4, and the house was filled with smoke. What is this house? What is this house that was filled with smoke? It is the Beit HaMikdash. It is the house of his presence, the house of the holiness of Adonai, perhaps a more literal translation. So this is the dream that Jacob is having, and it reminds us of the temple. And of course, what do we see at the top of the temple being like a ladder that goes up? We see Adonai there, standing at the top of the ladder. And he says this to Jacob. He says these 4 things. I am with you. I will watch over you. I will bring you back, and I will not forsake you until what I have promised has been accomplished. This is the story of the people of Israel. They were exiles to Haran, to Egypt, after returning to the land, exiles to Babylon, Persia, until returning again until the final destruction of the temple in 70 CE, as we discussed earlier. From 70 CE to 1948, we have the tremendous exile into all the world. Notice the parallel. It's a non-causal parallel. I'm not trying to make a point with this. I'm just trying to point out the parallel. The disbursement of the Jews into all the world and the instruction from Yeshua to go into all the world and make disciples, to teach the gospel, to make disciples in all the world. Adonai says, I am with you. This is these 3 statements. I am with you, I'll watch over you, I'll bring you back, and I will not forsake you until what I have promised has been accomplished. Okay. I am with you. Adonai is everywhere, not just tied to the land. This is important because if you're going to go in exile from the land, if the blessing of Adonai is the land, if Adonai has said, this is my land, then what happens if you leave the land? Well, if you leave the land, you leave Adonai. You lose Adonai. And he says, no, I'm with you always. I'm with you. This is important because later the people of Israel would be exiled. They would sojourn in Egypt, and Adonai would be with them in Egypt. Adonai is not just in the land of Israel. I will watch over you. The next line in these 4 pillars, I will watch over you. Jacob was going into danger, into what would eventually be hostile territory. I will watch over you. I will protect you. I will comfort you. I will bring you back. This is, for me, the most profound promise. Time and time again demonstrated in history. Exiled and returned, exiled and returned. Egypt and then returned. Destruction of Jerusalem and then return. Return in 1948 and finally again in 1967 into Jerusalem. And the 4th pillar, I will keep my promise. I will accomplish it. This is the ultimate expression of hope. This promise that's being made is a promise of Adonai guaranteeing his own promise. It is, I promise my promise. It is, I promise my promise, and I will accomplish it. It will be getting done. It will be guaranteed, which is what they did. And Adonai came to them and fulfilled his own promise, and we see that today. See, it's not that Israel has the power to... It's not that Israel has the power to force Adonai's hand to keep this promise. They don't. And in fact, what Israel demonstrates through the centuries, going back all the way to their first time in the land, what Israel demonstrates is an inability to keep up their side of the bargain. They continued to run after idolatry, after pagan worship, which they did again and again, and Adonai came against them. But Adonai was still going to keep his promise. He would just do it through another people. Remember Mordecai's quote to Esther, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. This has to do with deliverance from evil persons intent on destroying Israel. But consider also the parallel that Adonai would also abandon the people, expel them from the land, but for a remnant which would at some point be allowed to return and try again. And what is it that we read? Let me pull this up on another screen here. What is it that we read as a testimony, as a witness and testimony of this? We see this in Jeremiah. Let me just pull this up here while I'm thinking about it. And it's let's see what we got here. And it is I want to get you a reference on this. I may be able to pull it up on the screen. Alright, sorry about the delay. But everybody knows this, and everybody should be able to remember this. And it is this. Behold, days are coming. Let me get verse numbers for you. That way you can follow along, as some of you have requested that I use more verse numbers. So I'll try to use that more often. Behold, days are coming when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of a man, with the seed of a beast. Just as I have watched over them to uproot and pull down, to overthrow, to destroy, and bring disaster, then I will watch over them to build and to plant. That's verse 26. And it says this, verse 28, in those days the fathers have eaten, they will no longer say the fathers have eaten sour grapes, the children's teeth are blunted. Rather, each will die for his own iniquity. If anyone eats the sour grapes, his own teeth will be blunted. Verse 30, behold, days are coming. It is a declaration of Adonai when I will make a new covenant. Many of you are familiar with the new covenant of Jeremiah and its references in the Gospels. And many of you are familiar with the teaching of New Covenant theology, which in the Christian iteration oftentimes is a sort of replacement perspective. And this being one of the texts that is used to define, quote-unquote, the New Covenant. Unfortunately, the text is rather explicit that that interpretation is just flat wrong. Read with me, verse 30, behold, days are coming. It is a declaration of Adonai when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. It is a declaration of Adonai. I will put my Torah within them, and I will write it on their heart, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Some of your translations will say law. I put my law within them, and so forth. So this is what we have here. And then it continues, only if this fixed order departs from me, says Adonai, verse 35, then also might Israel's offspring cease from being a nation before me for all time. So Adonai is connecting the promise of Abraham, which was land and descendants, and using the further promise of Jacob, which is this, I am with you, I'll watch over you, I'll bring you back, and I will not forsake you. And these things are put together and demonstrated here that Adonai will again create a new covenant with the people. And it is made a new covenant made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. All right, why the bringing back? Why was it necessary to continue to bring back to Eretz Israel? Why was it necessary to keep coming back? And this is where the Jewish perspective in the Messianic movement is relatively easy, because the land of Israel is such a resource in the experience, in the faith, in the worship. The land and the experience of Israel is very, very helpful to live out a life of not just Torah observance, but just of worshiping Adonai in authenticity. Now, the Gentiles may struggle with this because of there's some confusion in this, that is it really truly necessary that the people of God be brought back to the land? And this is what I would say. What we see in the text is that coming back to the land, why does Adonai keep bringing them back? Because the land is the nursery of our faith. The land of Eretz Israel is where our faith is germinated and grows. And the kingdom of Adonai that comes after is likewise a nursery of our faith. What is it we come back to? We come back to knowing Adonai, God, in authenticity. But it is the land that provides a place to dwell, a place to be within that. And that is the same as the extension of that is the kingdom of Adonai, which is the fellowship of all those who believe in Yeshua. Again, the kingdom of Adonai does not have a regional geographical boundary. It does not have a language, but it does have a spiritual space. Wherever two or more are gathered, there I am with them. There is a spiritual, existential space to the kingdom of Adonai, and that is occupied by all the citizens who believe in Yeshua. What are the three things that define a nation? The first thing is that defines a nation is a regional boundary, some sort of geographic boundary. Australia's boundary is the great island of Australia. That is the nation. The second thing that defines a nation is not language, because languages, many nations share different languages. Spanish is spoken by dozens of nations, and English is spoken by a double handful of nations. Maybe a dozen nations speak English as a primary language. I mean, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Britain, UK, Ireland. There's others, small countries, United States, etc. But you can't say that language is what defines a nation, because again, many nations speak same languages. So what does that leave you with? Geographic locale, some sort of geographic boundary defining the nation, but also it is law. The laws of Canada are different than the laws of North America. Or I'm sorry, of the United States of America. The laws of New Zealand are different than the laws of Australia. This is what defines a nation. It is a geographical boundary wherein a set of laws applies. Well, do we have laws in the kingdom? You betcha. We've got a lot of laws in the kingdom. Our laws are the extent and the entirety of Torah, and then our laws are also to use love to permutate and to extend all the laws of Torah, such that Yeshua says, you have heard it said, do not murder, but I say to you, anyone who has hatred in their heart. Now, granted, these things were addressed by Torah. Don't hate your brother in your heart, it says. So Yeshua was definitely preaching from the Torah, and certainly not abolishing it or annulling it. He was perhaps commentating on it, but certainly not replacing it. But this is the first law, of course, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. We find this in the Torah. We also find this in the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament scriptures. This is the greatest mitzvot, the greatest instruction is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And we find that this is at work as a law within the nation of the believers in Yeshua. And it's interesting to me as the kingdom of Adonai is trying to find its way through turmoil in these last days. it's obvious that there's no geographic definition of the kingdom of God. You're not going to find one. But what would the next demarcation of a nation be? It would be their laws. And I think we need to go back to the laws of the kingdom, the rules of the kingdom, the way we function in the kingdom of Adonai. All right. And of course, the first of that is love. This is the greatest mitzvot, the greatest instruction, the greatest commandment. This is the greatest law. Matthew 22, verse starting 34. The Pharisees, when they heard that Yeshua had silenced the Sadducees, gathered together in one place, and testing him, one of them, a lawyer, asked, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the Torah? And he said, You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And so what we have is we have an emphasis on love in the Brit Chadashah, but it's an emphasis on love in such a way that it hangs, it provides the framework structure for everything else in the Torah. Mark 12, one of the Torah scholars came to and heard them debating, seeing that Yeshua had answered them well. He asked him, what commandment is the first of all? Yeshua answered, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment, other commandments that are greater than these. How is it that we are commanded to love Adonai? How can Adonai command our love, our devotion, our desire? Well, in one sense, he can command it because we are citizens of the kingdom of Adonai. And that's the nature of it. I am subject to the laws of Florida, of the United States of America. And they can command my responsiveness. And likewise, Adonai commands our love and our devotion, but you might stumble at that and ask the question, how can Adonai command this? How does one command these things? Most people on earth who demand such things are called tyrants and manipulators and abusers. Rather, Adonai has earned our love by his sacrifice, and this is the expression of the noble king who has become the sacrifice. He overcame those by the power of his word, which is truth. In becoming the sacrifice, he overcame death by the power of his word. For truth is his ultimate power. It is his, where he has invested his power is in truth. Yet this power, in the form of truth, became the fullness of love in the form of a sacrificial death, that we might also love him. And so if the land of Israel, the nation, the people of Israel are defined by, if they're not defined by a geographical boundary, which we find that they're not, because Judaism is alive and well in North America, and if Christianity is not defined by a geographical area, and we do find that Christianity is alive and well, then what we have is we have the Gentile and the Jew that are quite capable of worshiping Adonai in some measure of authenticity, in spite of not being in Eretz Israel. However, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is still there as a nursery, as a nursemaid to our faith. It is something we are connected and tied to. It is something that we are bound to, as it were. So what does these things mean? I am with you, I will watch over you, I will bring you back, and I will not forsake you until what I have promised has been accomplished. This was made to Jacob in the context of the blessing of Abraham. And since we are the extension of the blessing of Abraham, seeing it play out in our lives, in our neighbors' lives, if we are true Israel by virtue of our worship of Adonai and by our worship of Yeshua and his sacrifice for us, and by loving our neighbor as ourselves, if these are the laws upon which all others hang, and if these are the laws by which we draw near to him, then we truly are citizens of this peculiar nation, citizens of this peculiar people. Um, and now these phrases, I am with you, I will watch over you, I will bring you back, and I will not forsake you until I have promised what has been accomplished. Now these also apply to us in that sense that Adonai is with us even though we are sojourning, that Adonai is with us even though there are threats and dangers on every side, that he says he will watch over us, and that he will bring us back. First he will bring us back out of our lost places and our lonely places and into the fellowship of the kingdom with other believers, but then also bringing us back to our tie to Eretz Israel. Perhaps we don't immigrate to Eretz Israel, but at least we are tied to Eretz Israel, and we are tied to the descendants of Israel, and likewise tied to the worship, the true worship, the authentic worship, in spirit and in truth, of the people of God and the people of Jacob. What is it that we come back to? It says, I will watch over you, I will bring you back. What is it we come back to? We come back to loving the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and strength. This is what it says, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha ev'chol nefshafcha ev'chol me'odecha. This is the greatest mitzvot, the greatest instructions. Matthew 22. Again, we have these other examples of what is the greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, with all your heart, and with all your soul. In one iteration in Mark chapter 12, the Torah scholar came and heard them debating, and seeing that Yeshua had answered them well, he said, what commandment is first of all? And Yeshua answers, the first, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your mind. The second is like this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Again, when pressed on this, Yeshua answers, the first and the greatest is the Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That statement of worship, of identity, of connection, is what Yeshua is referring to here. Again, what is it that defines us? What is it we're coming back to? We're coming back to this restoration of these truths. So how is it that we are commanded to love Adonai? How can Adonai command our love, our devotion, our desire, our adoration, our affection? How can he command our honor? How does one command these things? Most people on earth who demand such things are not to be trusted. But rather, as I said, Yeshua is the noble king who has become the sacrifice. And he overcame by the power of his word, which is truth. And for truth is the ultimate power. Yet this power is in the form of truth. It became, this power over sin and death became the fullness of love in the form of this sacrificial death. Why? What is the purpose of this? That we might also love him, that we might engage with him in the fullness of what that means for understanding, for insight, and for wisdom. Okay, delightful as always. A lot of material this week, a lot of history. Great for some of you history buffs. Probably sleepy and boring for those of you who don't like history. For that, I apologize. Next week, we're going to be dealing with Jacob, and wrestling with the man at the brook. A very powerful moment in our understanding of our relationship with Adonai as the people of God. So look forward to joining with you then for that discussion. In the meantime, may Adonai bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you, and lift up his countenance upon you and give you rest. And just pray that you would have a good week. And one other item, if you'd like to join us for services, we are open for services on Shabbat. Just connect with us on our website, and you'll find directions there, our address, and we would look forward to fellowshipping and worshiping with you. With that, may Adonai bless you. Shalom, shalom.